Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, I should say, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program at CSIS. It's my great good fortune today to be able to host this event with Lorenzo Cordova. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on Plan B and the future of democracy in Mexico. Before we formally begin our event, I want to go through some of the event logistics, namely that this event will last for 60 minutes. Following the panelists' remarks and a moderated discussion, we will field questions from the audience. If you've got questions, you'll see this lovely QR code on the panels behind me. You can snap a photo of that QR code and you'll be taken to a site where you can put in your question, and then during the Q&A session, I'll have a chance to read some of those questions off. Please note that this live stream discussion will be made available on the event webpage after the conclusion of the event. It's perhaps a truism, but it bears repeating. Few countries impact one another more on a daily basis than Mexico and the United States. Trade, security, and even the bonds of culture, shared history, and family. What happens in the United States matters deeply to Mexico, and what happens in Mexico matters deeply to the United States. For this reason, when our neighbor's independent electoral institution, known as the INE in Spanish, is under assault, we are rightly concerned about the future of Mexico's cherished and hard-earned democracy. Not out of a desire to interfere in our neighbor's affairs, but rather an understanding of one of the most immutable facts in life. One cannot escape geography. On February 22nd of this year, Mexico's Senate passed an electoral reform known as Plan B that threatens to drastically cut the institution's budget, reducing its role in Mexico's electoral process. If implemented, the reforms stipulated in Plan B could compromise the integrity of elections and leave space for interference in the electoral process, which in turn would effectively reverse some of the democratic progress Mexico has made, the tremendous democratic progress Mexico has made since the establishment of the INE. With us today to delve into the state of democracy in Mexico and provide an outlook on democratic institutions in the country, we are joined by the INE's Consejero Presidente, Dr. Lorenzo Cordova Villanello. Dr. Cordova was elected as an electoral counselor of the former Federal Electoral Institute, the IFE, the predecessor institution. He has a degree in law from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM, and a PhD in political theory research from the University of Torino in Italy. He's a man after my heart, a trained political theorist. He is a part of the national researcher system in Mexico and serves as the lead expert on electoral law at the Institute for Legal Research at the UNAM. From 2010 to 2011, he was technical secretary of the work group that processed the political reform in the Senate and a board member of the Institute for Studies for a Democratic Transition. Dr. Cordova has written extensively about electoral law and political theory. He's also the author of two books I'd like to cite. The first is La democracia no se construyó en un día, and the other is La democracia no se toca. And he was awarded 2 National Journalism Awards. Before I invite Dr. Cordova to the stage, I want to note that a senior associate of CSIS, who possesses much more institutional knowledge than I do, informed me recently that CSIS has hosted every single INE or IFE director since the institution's establishment back in 1990. And so I'm delighted that today we can further that tradition of CSIS's commitment to Mexico's democracy. We are honored to host Dr. Cordova at such a pivotal time for the institution. Thank you for being here. Dr. Cordova, welcome. It's my understanding you have some slides and a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a huge honor being once again here at the CSIS. Brian, thank you so much for your kind presentation. And I hope 13 days before I end my mandate, I cannot assure that the future president, who shall be a woman, will be here, but I'm quite sure because following this long tradition, as you just mentioned. Thank you so much. I would like just to make a brief statements about the subject that convokes today here at CSIS. And to do that, I would like to make some briefings, some statements of context, and therefore make a few comments about what Plan B, the so-called Plan B of electoral reform means, and eventually the consequences that for the health of electoral system it comes with. The first thing I would like to say, and I think it's a good question when you face an electoral reform process elsewhere, is does this electoral system that you intended to reform works or not? And if it does, departing from a preliminary statement, always electoral reforms has something to get improved on, and obviously it could be better. I mean, that's a departure point of every analysis about electoral reforms. But the point is, it's necessary to change an electoral system. Does it work for what should it works in a democracy? That means the renewal of power in a peaceful way without any political conflict. Well, I should depart saying that Mexico's electoral system, the one that we had after a long transition, we built our electoral system throughout several reforms that gradually improved the equity conditions, the institutional capabilities to organize free and fair elections, to oversight the political financiation. In Mexico, oversight is fundamental, not just to the qualification of elections, but also to get equity conditions. So all these changes gradually improve our electoral system. The last of the main changes, the one to transform former IFE, a federal institution in charge of running federal elections, into a national elections, the INE, a national institution, the INE, in charge not just of the federal elections, but also of the coordination and the organization of the subnational, local, and municipal elections, is the result of the last major electoral reform, the 2014 reform. So, to answer the question if that system works and how does it work, we must see what's happening in the last 9 years. And that, where should I point off? Sorry, maybe you can help me with the passing some slides. Another one, please. Just an advertisement. This presentation is at your disposal. There are many slides. It's very large. I do not intend to take many time of yours. So some of the slides I will pass it very, very fastly. But the point is, in the last 9 years, INE has organized 331 elections. I'm considering federal and local elections, ordinary and extraordinary elections, a national recall, a national public consultation, and also a couple of primary electoral exercises in order to appoint the political presidents of two political parties. After, just to get a comparison, in 23 years of existence, IFE has organized 18 federal elections. So in these 9 years has been very busy for INE. No? When people ask me, what does INE what the INE does when you're not organizing elections, my answer always is, I don't know, because we're always organizing some kind of election in these 9 years. Well, 331 elections, and the thing I want to underline is that in no case in these 9 years we had a post-electoral conflict. which transformed these 9 years in the largest period in our history of political stability and democratic governance. Also, if you help me passing the slide, in this period, as a consequence of these 331 elections, the average of alternance, of political alternance, has risen until almost 62%. This means, in other words, that the chances in this period that a political party who has won an election wins the next electoral round is only 1 among 3. And no political party is the exclusive beneficiary of this phenomenon. All the political parties in Mexico has been benefited and has suffered this alternance, this amount of alternance. In some cases, such as in the governative elections, so the elections to elect the local executives, this amount has already arose until 70%. So I think this is the main proof that the electoral system works, that there are no frauds in elections in Mexico, intending frauds, the actuation of governments to broke the quality or the fairness of an election. Otherwise, you could not explain this amount of alternance. INE not only run elections in Mexico, we provide a lot of services, such as, if you help me with the next one, the next slide, such as the issue in these 9 years of almost 130 million of electoral IDs, which in Mexico, the so-called INE, Credencial del INE, is the main identity official instrument. And we use, the electoral list that supports the issues of this electoral IDs for many purposes beyond the electoral logic. For instance, we use the data, the personal data, including biometrics, that INE holds for the authentication of identification, for finance services, or even to identify unidentified bodies, which are part of the security drama in our country. May we skip to that? Another one, please. That has provoked that in these 9 years, INE trustability, public trustability, has reached unprecedented levels. In the polls who have been the poll exercises in the last year, INE reaches a public trustability between 65 and 70, even 76%. I've been noticed that next week there will be the last poll during my mandate about INE's trustability, and we're settled in 74%, which transformed INE in the civil state institution with the largest trustability and levels of agreement with the job we have done. A couple of slides more. In these 9 years also, another one please. In these 9 years also, we have faced several challenges. In first instance, in the beginning, the challenge to implementing the 2014 reform. It was a very important reform that, as I said, empowers INE to run also local and municipal elections. It was not an easy reform in terms of its implementation. Many scholars, many electoral specialists have advertised at the time that one is a reform impossible to instrument. And despite that, right now, that reform gives us, as I said, the largest period of political stability in our history. In 2015, the first federal elections that we run as INE, were also the first election submitted into a social boycott. For the first time in almost 100 years, the possibility, the chances to have an election, the realization of an election were undermining because several social actors intended and publicly claimed their intention to boycott elections. Despite that, 2015 elections could have been run without major problems, and it was the first election that shows that the new electoral model could be improved. In 2018, we faced our first election as a National Electoral Institute, It was the largest election in the history at the moment, and it was an election characterized by a severe polarization, and despite not just the turnout, but also the split between the first and the second post, it was very hard to take to good part in terms of the political conflictivity. In 2020, and therefore in 2021, we had to run one of the largest elections in Latin America in the context of the pandemic. And thanks to several, not just examples, comparative examples, but also several biosecurity protocols, the pandemic curves, the contagious curves, were not alterated because the realization of these elections. And the fifth challenge I would like to point is the fact that the elections and the recall and the consultation processes that we had to run in 2021 and 2022 were realized under a heavy attack in terms of disqualification coming from governmental circuits. The times in which an electoral authority has to face the accusations or the disqualification coming from opposition parties who lost elections leave the place to a new kind of harassment, a disqualification coming right now from the governmental circuits, which is something new. It's not a Mexican phenomena. It happens here in the US. It happens last year in Brazil's presidential elections. But it's part of the new era in which electoral authorities has to face this disqualification, the public's accusation of fraud coming from the power, paradoxically, coming from those who were beneficiary, who benefits the existence of free and fair elections. And finally, I mean, the last challenge, which is in course right now, and that will allow me to talk about the Plan B. The last challenge in these 9 years that INE has faced is the defense of democracy from the intentions to undermine throughout electoral reforms the integrity of our electoral system. To understand this last challenge, we pass a couple of slides, please? You must take in count. No, can you help me? A couple of slides more, please. No, oops. Get back another one. Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Yeah, sure. Thank you. To understand the effects and the thank you, and the challenges that the Plan B is supposed for electoral integrity in Mexico, you must take in count that this historical construction, which means build a strong electoral system with equality conditions for the contendants, is based in 5 main pillars. First, the autonomy and independence of the electoral bodies. Second, the building of a civil service, a very strong civil service, who is in charge of all substantial powers of INE. In third place, the permanent presence of INE all around the country. It's not easy to run elections in Mexico, believe me. We have security problems, we have social conflicts in very different senses all around the country. And for us to know what is going on in the field is fundamental. You cannot build trust with the people without having a permanent presence. Some of the public services we offer to the people, such as the issuing of the electoral ID, are permanent tasks. In a country with a highly demographic movements, it's fundamental for the INE know where the people is moving to, in order to, when we have to make an election, settle a polling station where it should be. I mean, close to the people so they can exercise their right to vote. So the permanent presence of INE all around the country, you must take in account, Mexico has 300 is divided in 300 electoral districts. In each one, the law has established we have to have an office. Is fundamental for the display electoral capabilities of INE during elections. The fourth pillar is that INE has to handle and is responsible for the integrity of the electoral list. The so-called Padrón Electoral since 1991 has been handled by an independent institution, not by the government, as it happens before, opening the door to several problems that, thankfully, we have lived in the past, such as members of the opposition who were rasurados, take it out from the list, electoral list, or dead people who were in the list and they also voted, and so on. So the building of an electoral list is fundamental. As I mentioned before, that list represents the largest personal database in the country, including biometrics, which allows us to provide different public services as the one I mentioned before. And the fifth pillar is the fairness in electoral competition, based in order to provide equality conditions for the different competitors, electoral competitors. We achieved this fairness in electoral competition throughout three mechanisms. The first one is very important public financiation for political parties, which guarantees that money should not be determined for winning or losing elections. The second mechanism is exactly the opposite of what you have here in the US. I mean, if you want to understand how the political communication system works in Mexico, you must think in Citizens United versus the Federal Electoral Commission, and imagine what exactly is the opposite. No, in Mexico, it's forbidden the acquisition to pay for publicity, political publicity in radio and TV. We use the state times in order that the political parties can show their TV programs and spots among the populations and so on. And the third mechanism is the prohibition for every public servant, from the president to a major, to interfere in the electoral competition. During campaigns, they cannot be pronunciated itself in favor or against any political competitor. And of course, they cannot use public funds in order to promote or disqualify any competitor. Well, these pillars, and this is important, are not just established, but also warranted by the Constitution. All of them are established in our Constitution. That's why the attempt of President López Obrador, when he presented a bill to a constitutional amendment last year that undermined all these 5 pillars, was so important to get stopped in the Congress. Indeed, in the lower chamber, they didn't reach the qualified majority which is needed to approve a constitutional amendment. And that's why, after that A plan failed, they presented the so-called Plan B. The Plan B is a reform, a legal reform, that involves 6 different laws that has to do with electoral issues, that at the end of the day still undermine these 5 pillars. You can ask yourself, why, if those pillars are in the Constitution? Well, that's why we have compelled this legal reform besides the Supreme Court, because they are unconstitutional. In the next slides, which I won't stop except in one of them, but they are at your disposal, I present some issues, just some issues, on how each one of these pillars is eroded and contradicted by the legal disclosures. So I will skip some of them, and I will get to the main concern that we have because of this legal reform, which is the undermining and the dismantling of the incapacities to organize elections. So if you help me with the, I think it's already worked. Yeah, that's it. I won't stop on how this reform undermining autonomy and independence independence. I will stop here because this is what I was talking about. The main damage that this Plan B brings with is the dismantling of the professional structure that allows us to run elections. As I mentioned, one of the main axes of our democratization process was to build a civil service which is in charge of the substantial responsibilities. Right now, as you can see in the bottom of the box in the right, our civil service is integrated by 2,571 public servants. All these people get into their jobs throughout public contests. They are permanently trained. They are permanently under qualification and evaluation of their jobs. Well, the reform, the Plan B, simply disappear 85% of those posts. I'm not talking about 8.5. I'm talking about 85%. More than 2,000 members of this civil service are fired by disposition of the law. And this is specifically dangerous in the lowest level on the INE's organization. As I mentioned before, INE has a permanent presence in each one of the 300 electoral districts. In every one of these districts, by the former law, INE has an office and a board who is responsible for the work of INE in that district. Let me stop here a couple of minutes. Each one of this board is, with the previous law, integrated by 5 members, all of them part of the civil service that I mentioned. Well, one of them is the vocal ejecutivo, which is the responsible to coordinate the works of the board. The second one is the vocal secretario, which is at the same time the responsible for the juridical issues. No, it's a sort kind of a juridical responsible of the work of the board, and as well as the administrative responsible. The third member of this board is the vocal de organización. This public servant is responsible for the logistics during elections in the whole district. He has to identify the places in which polling stations should be installed, schools or private homes eventually. He's responsible to guarantee those spaces. He's responsible to provide all the material issues that should be necessary at the polling stations. He's responsible to define the logistics to take all the electoral materials to every polling station, and then at the night of elections to take him back in coordination with the military. He's responsible to operate the program of preliminary electoral results the night of election, and he's also the responsible for the counting of the votes in the districtal counting of votes, which is the legal counting of votes. Then there is a vocal de capacitación. He's responsible to engage all the temporary public servants that help us with the elections, to train them. He's responsible also to make the lottery. Maybe you should know that in Mexico, the polling station officers are not appointed discretionally by INE. They are the result of a raffle, of a lottery, among the whole electoral list. We have to select 13% of the electoral list, which means almost 13 million people, which has to be visited by us at their homes in order to invite them to participate and train them and select them at the end of the day to become polling station officers. That's supposed the largest field work that Mexican state has to do just after census, and it's coordinated by the vocales de capacitación. And finally, the fifth member of this board is the vocal del Registro Federal de Electores. He's responsible to overview the functioning of the so-called módulos de atención ciudadana, which are our offices in which we issue the electoral ID. He's also responsible to the depuration and validation of the electoral list. The electoral list moves every day. Every day we receive 60,000 movements. He's also responsible to identify how is the demographic movements going on, if a part of the city is growing, if some other part is getting unpopulated, and so on, in order to identify where the electors live. And finally, he's responsible to print the electoral list, the list of voters that each one of the polling stations should have. Well, the plan B not just disappears this board, but substitutes these 5 members of the civil service for 1 people. And we're talking about the bodies that's allowed us to make elections. I mean, it could be understandable, not justifiable, but the disappearing of the main board, of the Consejo General, but not of these local boards, which allowed us to operate elections. A couple of comments more. I was talking about the electoral registration, the electoral list. Well, the reform established that the voters list from abroad should be validated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I mean, we pass from a plenty administration from the electoral body, an autonomous institution of the electoral list, into a determination by an office of the government of whom are able to vote from abroad. Not only that, right now, having an electoral ID is the key to the exercise of the political rights. And the reform established that you can enlist it on that list with your passport or your matrícula consular, which are documents under the control of the government. So, at the end of the day, no independent institution but the government will have the power to decide who can vote or not from abroad, which is very dangerous in our point of view. And finally, the last point I would like to underline is the fact that one of those pillars of equity, which is the obligation of neutrality from the public servants, right now should be understood as freedom of speech. So legally, the government, the public servants, from the president to the majors, are able right now to say whatever they want against, in favor, or against a public contender, an electoral contender. Going against what is established in the Constitution, because I said all these 5 pillars are warranted by the Constitution. Well, that's why we went to the Supreme Court. Right now, those appealings are in course. The Supreme Court should solve those accusations of unconstitutionality of these legal reforms in the next few months. It's very important because the electoral process, 2024 presidential electoral process, will start in September, next September. And according to the constitutions, all the rules should be established and defined by the beginning of June. So this is the time of the court. I would like to finish with a note of optimism. We have built strong institutions as INE, as well as the Supreme Court. And not only that, we are not alone. The institution, the democratic institutionality has been supported by, an inheritus phenomena, which is the people coming to the streets to protest against the Plan B, and not just to protest against a public policy or in favor of some right, but to defend institutionality. I mean, what happens in November and in last February is something that gives us hope and make us strength. It's not the same to face the accusations coming from the power, even if we are a state organization, a state agency, if we feel alone, that if we feel, covered by, the people who are claiming just not against the government, not in favor of a political party, but just to continue to have free conditions to exercise their vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us, Dr. Cordova. I'm sure you could have gone on for much, much longer, but it was already quite a tour de force, and we thank you very much for that. We're joined this afternoon as well by 2 other outstanding experts in the area of elections and democracy, so this will be the panel portion of our event today. First, we have Deborah Ulmer, who's the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean programs at the National Democratic Institute. Deborah has over 20 years of experience managing democracy assistance programs and has worked throughout Latin America for over 12 years. And next to her is seated Maximo Zaldivar, Regional Director for the Americas at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. He has over 20 years of experience in democracy, elections, political processes, and has extensive experience managing democracy and governance programs around the world. Thank you both for being here. I've asked both of you to give 4 or 5 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll get into a panel discussion as well. So over to you, Deborah, to start.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, Dr. Cordova. During a time when democratic elections around the world face an evolving and increasingly complex set of threats and challenges, NDI is proud to stand with the INE, with the National Electoral Institute, which has been responsible for guaranteeing free and fair elections as a cornerstone of Mexico's democracy. However, the recent approval by Mexico's Congress of the electoral reform package known as Plan B is testing the health of the country's democracy. Like other Latin American governments, Mexican institutions and processes face growing threats, including corruption, organized crime, profound political polarization, and social and political conflict, mis- and disinformation, and irregular migration. Since 2000, trust in Mexican elections have been generally high. The main exception was in 2006, when the then candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador and his supporters alleged fraud. Nearly 20 years later, President López Obrador is again trying to sow doubt in the integrity of Mexico's elections. The Plan B reforms threaten to roll back more than 30 years of Mexican democratic advances, as you outlined, Dr. Cordova. And as a former Mexican ambassador recently put it, at the end of the day, the Plan B changes put Mexicans' right to vote in free, fair, and credible elections at risk. Nevertheless, Mexicans I have spoken with are hopeful that their democratic institutions will hold and that the independent Supreme Court of Justice will continue to serve as an important counterweight to anti-democratic measures. Mexican civil society, however, are concerned about the onslaught of President López Obrador's discourse against several autonomous constitutional bodies, in addition to calling into question the legitimacy of civil society and the media, in a country where human rights defenders and independent journalists suffer a high rate of violence. Another big challenge is the high level of polarization in Mexican society. Baseless allegations of electoral fraud is especially dangerous in this context and could end in post-election violence, such as what we've seen, Dr. Cordova, in Brazil on January 8th. The United States and the international community should consider 3 actions. The first is the Summit for Democracy on March 29 and 30, which provides an opportunity for democratic governments in Latin America to stand together. It's important to show for independent electoral bodies and their critical roles in promoting citizen trust in their vote. The international community should also continue to work with Mexican civil society to bolster the independent democratic institutions such as the INE, and at a point when INE's independence and operational capacity are at risk, assess whether the inclusion, transparency, accountability, and overall credibility of the process is preserved. And preserve the space for civil society to actively participate in Mexico's election processes at a time when the government is intensifying attacks against independent voices. Finally, it is important to expand support to other democratic institutions in Mexico and not let this challenge overshadow others. The United States and other democratic governments can elevate the importance of democracy and electoral integrity in their bilateral agendas with Mexico. It's important that Mexico's international partners state clearly that this is a top priority issue and to work to find solutions that mitigate the potential harms of Plan B and the negative signal that this could send to the rest of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for that. Maximo?
Thank you, Ryan. And many thanks to CSIS for the opportunity to be today in this important panel, sharing the panel with Deborah, an esteemed colleague within the CEPS consortium, and of course with Mr. Lorenzo Cordova, who has been an ally in the promotion of democracy, a strategic partner, but also a dear friend of IFES. Many people will tell you that it's pretty normal that in Mexico you undergo electoral reforms every 4 to 5 years, and that it might be also pretty normal that Morena is seeking a share within INE. And that might be partially true, but as Lorenzo has clearly pointed out, there was never, and there is currently no political consensus around the reform, and also the attempt to have influence within INE is something that was never, of the level that never seen before in the current selection process of the people that will succeed Lorenzo and the three other members. Now, saying that, I want to focus quickly, because I know the time has been shortened a little bit. I want to focus on key moments that I think have been left out of the contextual discussion of what's going on in Mexico, but I think are the key moments that build up the sentiment to Morena and for the president to make the decision to speed up the electoral reform process. The first point, Morena had the opportunity to present electoral reforms before the midterm federal elections in 2021. They did not for one reason. They had internal problems to fix before focusing on drafting a bill. The problems were the following. They had serious discrepancies with their internal registry of the party. Only 21% was been able to be validated of that, and 79% presented inconsistencies. And also, they had to deal with the election of the internal leadership now that President López Obrador was sitting in office. The court allowed them an extensive deadline to fix everything, and even INE allowed them to conduct the selection of their new leadership through a survey instead of holding a national political party assemblies. Second point, the rejection of the courts for the presidential recall referendum to take place the same day as the midterm federal elections, which I think the decision was very accurate, and it was something that the president had been advocating strongly and intensively for that to happen. Third point, the actual results of the midterm federal elections, even that it was a big victory for the incumbent party, however, they had to scale down in seats in Congress. They reduced from 256 seats they had in 2018 to only 197 in 21, therefore not reaching the qualified majority in order to pass constitutional amendments, even with the help of its allies, the PT and the Green Party. Fourth point, and I think this is a turning point, is the two controversial, and I won't go into the reason or discussing them, I'm just showing the facts, the two popular population processes, which Lorenzo clearly showed in his chart. The first on August 1st of 2021, to be able to initiate actions against political decisions taken by previous administrations, which only reached 7.11% of turnout. And the next one on April 10, 2024, and the recall referendum, which only got 17.7 turnout. Both very low turnouts, and who did not reach the required 40% threshold, which would have made those results legally binding. This hurt deeply President López Obrador, and this is where he started to actually confront INE and blaming INE that they did not their best effort to promote both of these popular consultations. Now, just briefly, I want to mention some of the ideas that have been left out of the Plan B. In the original draft of 938 pages, and with only 2 pages of statements of reasons, any legislator in its correct mind would have rejected when you get a draft bill of almost 1,000 pages and only 2 pages of statement of reason. And I want to mention those briefly. Of course, the crazy idea to exchange or swap INE with the new National Elections and Consultations Institute, INEC, the elimination of all state-level election management bodies, the OPLs in Mexico, including the one in Mexico City, the elimination of all state-level elections courts, including the one in Mexico City, and the most strange of all, to elect by popular vote the members of the new INE and the elections court out of a list proposed by the president and by Congress. If this would have passed, this reform would have not only been a regressive one, it would have vulnerated immensely Mexico's electoral system as we know it by now. Thank you very much, and we leave space for the questions.
Thank you very much. Maximo, I want to ask a couple questions of the panelists, and then we're still collecting questions. Remember, folks, you've got the QR codes on the panels to the side of me. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and snap the QR code with your phone. You'll come to a website where you can input a question, and then we'll take them quite soon during the Q&A portion of today's event. I want to ask a question that comes out of Deborah's opening remarks. She gave a couple recommendations for the international community, and so I want to start with you, Dr. Cordova, and then I want to ask Maximo, and I actually have a different question for you, Deborah, so I'll come to you after that round. But the question is basically the Washington question, which is, we're sitting here in a think tank, we often think, we need to do more. The international community needs to do more. What can we do, right? That's the natural impulse here in this town. And so the question is, what can the international community do? What can the United States and Canada do as neighbors who are concerned about their friend and partner in Mexico? Or is this going to backfire? And I'll give a little bit of a context here in the sense of the weekend after the protests, the photos of which you showed in your presentation, López Obrador was complaining quite loudly that the Wall Street Journal had published photos from this support for the INE on its front page coverage, and made the claim that Mexico had more democracy than the United States. I don't want to debate that claim here today, but I do want to ask you whether the United States and Canada being seen as taking action will help or hurt, because I like Deborah's suggestions, but I also want to be sensitive. So first you, Dr. Cordova, and then Maximo, and I have a different question for you, Deborah.
Okay, Brian, I think it's very important because that's a question I've been asked for in this couple of days very oftenly, which is natural. I mean, I think just a brief statement of context. Even if democracies and the health of democracies is responsible of each one of our countries, right now we live in a global context and environment, democratic environment. So the concerns about what is happening in another country in terms of its democratic health and situation, it's a global matter. It happens last year in Brazil, the Brazilian election, because our countries are not isolated islands. We as Mexican, we were worried of what was happening in Brazil, the largest democracy in Latin America, because we are aware of a domino effect. And I think what is happening right now in Mexico, which is not an isolated case, there are a lot of links of what is happening in American democracy or Brazilian democracy or even in other parts of the world. So I think, just to underline, that it's very important to be concerned what is happening in terms of the health of democracy in our neighbors or close countries. After saying that, let me say it like this. Yes, in a certain point, President López Obrador is right. I mean, what is happening with our democracy essentially is our problem. After saying that, yes, but no. I don't want to create here a paradox. What I intend to say is that I think international community is responsible to create a context of exigence within our countries. I mean, to know for us that we are being watched for international community is very important. I mean, not because we are afraid of an international intervention or something like that. No, that's not the point. But the same happened last year in Brazil, when President Bolsonaro claims that the voting machine are able to be suffer hacking or something like that. The international response, the point of view in international missions, saying we trust, and I mean, from our point of view, voting machines, Brazilian voting machines are trustable. It's a sort kind of create a context of exigence. So I think that's very important. I mean, we have to solve our problems. And I trust a lot in the strengthness of our democratic institutions, right now at the Supreme Court. But I think it's very important to watch each other, as well as let me say like that, I just said it today in the State of the Department, we're watching Mexico. Yeah, yes, thank you so much. It's necessary for us. But we're also watching you as Mexicans, because the health of American democracy is very important for us. And finally, I think we have to rethink not just the logic, but also the importance of international observation. I hope 2024 elections, despite what's the end of the story of the Plan B, I hope the court declares it unconstitutional, and therefore that we could go to 2024 elections with the legal framework that allows us until now stability and democracy and democratic conditions. But despite that, it's very important international observation. Hopefully, next year, I hope so, we'll have the largest international observation ever. Max knows well, that happens in Brazil. And I'm not saying that finally democracy in Brazil survive because of the international observation. But I want to point out that the international observation is fundamental in the times of threats for democracy all around the world in order to guarantee electoral integrity.
Maximo, give me your best 3 recommendations.
Yes, following up on what just Lorenzo said, and I think we can look back. There have been timely actions in the past, which was the election in Mexico in 2000, which a political key transition in the country with an important presence of international observation. But also, I think efforts like technical missions of experts, which INE has conducted before. We have been together with INE in challenging in key elections, helping and in solidarity with them. So I think that is something that could be done again or even strengthened. Democracy is a human value, and the right of suffrage is a human right. Anything that attempts against it, wherever it's coming from, should not be ignored.
Deborah, I mentioned that I have a different question for you. You laid out 3 really strong recommendations in your opening remarks. And we just heard from Dr. Cordova that expressions of concern from neighbors is an important thing because it basically allows the country to know that they're not alone and that people are watching and paying attention. Why do you think that the State Department and other institutions and the Biden administration generally has been, I would characterize it as relatively silent on this issue, relatively quiet about Plan B? Is there a reason?
Well, I won't speculate on why they've been quiet, but I would say that as the U.S., we have seen the strength of Mexican democracy. Latin Americans have seen the strength of Mexican democracy and believe that it hasn't been an issue, right, for the past 30 plus years. As such, there's been importance placed on other issues. As a democratic institution dedicated to strengthening and supporting and accompanying democratic institutions, I would say that the U.S. should pay attention and it should matter to the U.S. and to other international democracies because INE has served as a global gold standard. I want to say that again. You're the global gold standard for election integrity. And that's why this matters. The attacks on INE matters. We've seen in the United States, we've seen it in Brazil. Important democracies will affect, and the others in the region, the autocrats in the region are watching to see what happens in the region. So I think it's important that democracies stand with the Democrats.
Thank you very much, Deborah. We're going to go to the Q&A portion of our event today. We've got our program coordinator and research assistant, Henry Ziemer, back there curating some of the questions. Go ahead, Henry, with the first one from the audience.
Thanks, Ryan. A recent poll from Morning Consult showed that AMLO lost 12 percentage points of job approval between December 6th and today, from 73% to 61%. With the rise in disapproval towards AMLO that reached a record high, do you imagine that this damage to AMLO's reputation will be lasting? And what does it mean for Morena's chances at the next election?
Dr. Cordova, you'd like to answer that question?
Well,
there's a lot there.
Yeah. Well, let me say that like this. I mean, Mexico is facing a lot of problems, and as well as many democracies. I mean, and that's a part of the reason of the weakness of democracy in the current times. I mean, you want strong democracies, I would like to say, well, solve the problem of the inequality in first instance, because that's one of the main reasons or the issues that conform this, the current melting pot in which, the authoritarian spirits are breeding of, as feeding of. But anyway, I mean, the point is why President López Obrador's popularity is falling down. Well, I would say it's incredible. It's amazing that having all the problems we are having right now, we still have a president with a large popularity. And I think that's explainable because we have a president with an enormous capability of communicate. And that's, I think that's something you must take in account on. However, I'm not quite sure. I mean, that popularity is the popularity of the president. I'm not quite sure if in the next months he can translate that popularity into his parties, into his party. And I don't know once the candidate should be decided, the Morena's candidate should be decided, if that candidate can be transmitted that popularity. I mean, President López Obrador popularity is a phenomenon that should be studied itself. Well, by the way, many of the future of Morena, from my point of view, depends on how they can solve, they could solve, the definition of its presidential candidacy. Morena is a very complex political entity. Max just said it. We are very responsible to define through a poll who will be the president of that party. And believe me, it was not easy. It was not easy. By the way, INE didn't want to make that poll, and Morena didn't want that INE make that poll. It was a tribunal decision. So what I intend to say is, just to be short, is that it's very interesting from the point of a political scientist what is going and what will go on with Morena. Because Morena is much, it's something, they said it's a movement. And in many senses, it's a movement. It's not necessarily a political party. Of course they have a registration such as, but it's something that goes beyond the traditional political party. So it's very difficult to speculate what will happen with Morena in the next election. Of course, they are the ruling party, and at the end of the day, they're right now. If you look at the polls, they have they're leading the polls. So it's also probable that in the next years, even if nothing is written already, they are the favorite contenders for the presidency. No? But it's
I just want to add a little bit on the second part of the question, because numbers are numbers, and those are up to interpretation. However, Morena has a dilemma, which is going to the polls without AMLO. Yeah. And if you try to be a bit creative, you can imagine that was his reason he wanted so hard and badly to have the recall referendum the same day of the federal midterm elections, because the party was uncertain trying without him. Well, they tried, they did pretty well, but now it's different, right? Now everything is at stake, and they have this dilemma to solve, how to go to an election without him.
Henry, I think we'll take one more quick question from the audience, if you want to read the next one.
Absolutely. Our last question is, given the evident support of civil society to protect INE and democracy in Mexico, as shown by recent protests and activism, what can realistically be done inside of Congress to keep Congress members accountable for representing their constituents' interests? In other words, how can we explain the contradiction of Congress's legislative action with citizens' concerns?
Deborah, do you want to jump in on this one, since you didn't jump in on the last one? I think this is in your wheelhouse here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, as citizens, civil society plays a watchdog role. And it's important, that, and there's a strong civil society in Mexico. The outpouring onto the streets, I have to say, in favor of INE and against the reforms that are regressive reforms is a phenomenon we have never seen in Latin America. Yeah. Think about the protests in Latin America have all been against action, against government actions, or for fighting for their freedoms. Yeah. This is why I want to stick a pin into and make a special note of the citizens' right to observe their elections and the citizens' right to play that oversight role. It's important because those are the first freedoms that start to be rolled back. Those are the freedoms that are being attacked by the president today. Just look at what happened to Nicaragua. Look at the independent journalists. Look at human rights defenders. Look at those who are being attacked. It's an important and it's a negative signal, unfortunately, but this is why civil society showing their strength and playing and insisting on that oversight role to ensure checks and balances is so important for the health of a democracy.
Thank you, Deborah. I want to offer you each a chance to make about 1 minute of closing remarks, and I'll start with you, Maximo. And I'll ask you, just if you have a couple seconds in your opening remarks, to ruminate for a second on what does the future of elections look like in Mexico if Plan B goes into place? If you want to touch on that for a second as well.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. I mean, we're seeing this happening everywhere. At the beginning of this year in Peru, a bill was put in to reduce the term of the three leaders of the three election authorities in Peru. In Guatemala, we saw recently an unfruitful attempt of electoral reform. One in Dominican Republic has kind of taken shape. But just this week, in my country, the National Assembly fast-tracked a bill by the incumbent party to eliminate the article of our electoral code which prohibited to reform anything 1 year prior to the election. So in El Salvador now, everything is up for grabs, and we have no idea what changes will be coming up in the next few days. So this is happening everywhere. But it's funny how the trend is to benefit from the electoral system and gain power, legitimize themselves, but then saying everything is wrong. Yeah, but you used that to get in power. Why didn't you say before that it was wrong, right? So this is a trend, unfortunately, but hopefully it will change. Now, specifically to Mexico, I'm very trustful of their court system. I hope that whatever the outcome is, cooler heads will prevail, and Morena will try to seek some political consensus around what is coming up in Mexico, and I'm pretty confident that might happen.
Deborah?
Well, like Max and Dr. Cordova, I'm hopeful that Mexico's institutions will show their strength. But now, more than ever, it's important to stand with democracies when democratic institutions, electoral management bodies, and election integrity is being attacked around the world. I do hope that everything will turn out okay. But as you once said, Dr. Cordova, hoping is not a plan, and you always plan for the worst. And so I do hope that we would see a robust international election observation and citizen election observation to accompany INE during this difficult moment.
Thank you. Dr. Cordova, last word.
Well, I really trust that the Supreme Court will declare the unconstitutionality of this Plan B. Of course, it's possible that it's allowed, and we will be in severe problems next years, because for the first time, after 30 years of building, free and trustable elections, the only thing which was for sure until now, which was the capability, the organizational capability of INE, will be compromised. However, the legislative procedure of this reform opened the possibility, the high possibility, that even without a pronunciation about the constitutionality or not of the substance of the reform, the Supreme Court can determine that those regular procedures were violated, and therefore all the reform will fall down. Just an example. In the lower chamber, between the presentation of the Plan B, it was registered, in legislative terms, the Plan B, and its approval by the whole chamber, just passed 3 hours and a half. It was not a fast track, it was an hyper-fast track. Hyper-fast track. And therefore, I mean, and among many other violations of the legislative procedure. So I really believe that the Supreme Court has all the elements to declare, to invalidate this Plan B. However, and I'd like to finish with this, I think that should be the best for Mexican democracy. And I trust very much in the success on politics in the designation of our replacements. By the way, the General Council, the board, the directive board of INE is integrated by 11 members, and 7 of them will remain at their posts. So the largest part is an experienced one, and has already proved its independence and commitment with the electoral integrity. But we must take in account that very probably, if the Plan B falls down, there will be a harassment, there will be an incrementation in the harassment against the Supreme Court. So the failure of Plan B is a good thing for those who want to undermine the trustability of democratic institutionality. I mean, the Supreme Court will be condemned and accused to protect, you know, the past, the conservative, the frauds, and so on. And not only that, you must take in account that the justification for the proposal of a constitutional amendment of the president was his intention to avoid that electoral frauds could be committed, such as it happens. So the failure of Plan B maybe will open the door, unfortunately, such as it happened in the US and Brazil, from a narrative of fraud, of anticipated fraud, coming from the power. And therefore, there will be the time for the INE stakeholders and civil society to build a counter-narrative in order to explain why, with the current rules, in Mexico, frauds are impossible, or at least we have built an electoral system to avoid exactly those frauds. And I would like to end just saying this. I like to say that the building of democracy is not something that falls from the power, from the government. It's something that has been constructed by the efforts of the people. And when democracy is compromised, it's responsible of the people to defend their creation. And that's, I hope, that's what is happening in Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for being here. This was a tremendous. This was a tremendous conversation, and we as CSIS, as I mentioned, our historic relationship with INE and IFE, look forward to our continued relationship with the INE and inviting back, not Dr. Cordova, unfortunately, but his successor to come and visit us in future.
If you invite me in the future as a scholar, I will be here.
We'll be happy to do that as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Cordova of the INE, Deborah Ulmer of the National Democratic Institute, and Maximo Zaldivar of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Thanks very much.